Something that I have long found fascinating in art is subversion and rule breaking, a fascination that's only gotten stronger as I've seen more and more which tries to adhere to expectations and standards. While this feels like it's gotten more popular in recent years, especially with the prevalence of meta-narrative in horror games that more often than not play on corruptions of nostalgia and trope, subversive or anti-X art isn't anything new. For as long as there have been trend-setting works to copy from grain for grain, there's been works atomizing and rebuilding those grains to question just what it is we're doing with them and what moving past them can represent. Are there drawings to be made of no order nor theory and only feeling? Are there beautiful songs to be sung without any conception of a note or tone? And among many others, but most relevant to this video, are there stories about humanity to be told outside the familiar forms without conflict and with love for mundanity and all that would drive most readers away? To put the flowery prose aside for a second, yeah, absolutely. These kinds of works can be hard to understand for those not used to them, but given time and sincere engagement, there's a lot you can glean from both outsider art and art made by people actively desiring to go against convention. And in the case of one niche visual novel, there's an exploration into grief and reality that could be done no other way. SeaBed is a title that feels like it is actively trying to defy explanation. Released in 2015 exclusively for Windows in Japan as an all-ages doujin or indie work, later translated to English, Mandarin, and Cantonese with an updated release on Steam and Switch, it follows the lives of two women in love who've drifted apart for reasons unknown and now appear to live in conflicting, mirroring worlds. Contradictory truths presented to the player which ask them to solve the mystery. What happened to them and what even is their reality? Surreal mysteries are far from uncommon and in and of themselves aren't really subversive or questioning of the medium they're set in, but what sets SeaBed apart from any other VN I've read, hell, any other fiction I've read, is the absurd dedication to portraying everything that happens in it with fine and even detail. It is slow, hypnotic, and verbose, choosing to leave it up to the viewer to decide what does and doesn't matter for making sense of things or how important the puzzle even is. At the core of SeaBed is, to quote Friends, a mystery in search of a mystery, choosing to instead embrace the joy of all the mundane parts of life that come in the midst of trying to make sense of your world as you grieve. And that might make it sound kind of like an iyashike, but the actual execution of it is far different. There are no typical anime tropes here, no special attention paid to the beauty of any particular thing. It is just a portrayal of the lives of a few people, displayed honestly, free of judgment, like a flat and plain diary rather than an explicit work of fiction. From grief to spirituality to subjectivity and so much more, SeaBed is a story about many things that wears its stylings on its sleeves and has no apprehensions about those being filtering. The mixture of plodding flat prose, super slow dialogue, pointedly pointless scenes, and sometimes confusing dialogue flows, flat line of narrative tension, and in media res story structure all come together to make it a work I can't describe as anything but abrasive. But I mean that lovingly in the same way someone would call a game like Elden Ring challenging. If that abrasivity clicks with you and becomes something you vibe with, then the experience of reading SeaBed is like that of being in a trance. Watching the lives of all those within unfold to slowly deliver a loving tummy punch of heartwarming Yuri and melancholic reality. It is a beautiful, complicated work of art and one that's left me looking back at my own griefs and perceptions of reality in a new, more optimistic light, with a piece I'd never known before. And if you'd also like to explore things you've never known before, like maybe this game before I go into a ton of depth, may I suggest the sponsor of today's video, DL Site? Independent works are one of the key driving forces of any form of media. When freed from the grips of corporate interests, artists can accomplish some seriously amazing things, and the indie scene in Japan has long been an amazing demonstration of this. Toho, Higurashi, the Nasuverse, plenty of amazing series and universes started out as a scrappy effort and sometimes continue on like that to this day. For those living outside of the country though, finding these kinds of cool and inspiring works can be a huge challenge, especially if you don't know Japanese. And that's where DL Site comes in. With nearly 500,000 works digitally available, they're one of the largest distributors of independent and niche Japanese media of all shapes and sizes. If you've watched my channel for a while now, you've probably heard their name turn up a fair bit, and that's because a good chunk of the PC games I've covered here are readily available for purchase there. From the fun and erotic worlds of Bishoujo Mangekyo to the brilliant horror cult classics of Kusarihime and Extravaganza, the bizarre Dempo worlds of works like Fushigi Densha, and of course Yuri like today's classic SeaBed, DL Site has something for everybody. Whether you're looking for games, comics, ASMRs, or any other myriad of things in between, there is so much to discover in multiple languages, not just Japanese. And buying things is a cinch too. Simply use your credit card of choice to buy points for DL Pay, add them to your account, and be on your merry way to enjoy whatever lascivious or wholesome art has caught your eye, all while being certain that your money is going right to the creators that you want to see more from. And as a special thanks to sweeten the deal, DL Site has partnered with me again to give the first 500 of you 20% off one item. So if this game strikes your fancy fancy or there's a particular doujin you've been on the fence about buying, then there is no better time than now to follow along with the link in the description and go on a new journey. A huge thank you goes to DL Site for sponsoring this video. I've not only had a great time working with them here and in the past on the Kusari Hime video, but I've personally found their website to be seriously helpful in getting the games that I want to cover for this channel. Their dedication to making Japanese works available across the world is commendable, so if you've got any interest in this game or any other incredible indie works from Japan, then I really encourage you to check out that coupon and explore the wonderful world that awaits. And speaking of wonderful worlds, I think it's finally time to dive properly into SeaBed and see what lies at the bottom of the ocean for a troubled, beautiful couple. What would you do if you began to see and hear specters of those you loved in your past? That's not a question many of us have to wonder, but it's one that's begun to plague Mizuno Sachiko, a woman in her late 20s running a graphics design business with her co-workers and, most important of all, her partner Takako. The two have been together longer than they can remember, eventually sealing the deal to live together, found a business, and work together. Or so it seems. While the couple was together up until recently, the Takako that Sachiko had been seeing in her life as of late is nothing more than a hallucination, because for almost a year now, she's been gone. Those hallucinations, not seen before now, are theorized by psychiatrist and personal friend Narasaki Hibiki to be a result of stress and living in a place with constant reminders of her former lover. The conclusion the two come to is that Sachiko needs to take time to herself somewhere far away in a place unfamiliar, with her deciding on a European-styled inn run by an old friend Nanae Fujisaka. While everything seems to go well at first, questions start piling up as the hallucinations refuse to leave her, and imagining a world without Takako becomes all the more challenging. Even more bizarre is the reveal to the player of Takako possibly still being alive, staying in a nursing home after being admitted for a mysterious disorder causing horrible spasms and sudden memory loss. Day by day, her memory of Sachiko grows weaker, only wishing to be able to remember what their life together was like so she too can move on from a vague, cloudy past. Explored in that clinic, which looks bizarrely similar to the inn which Sachiko is staying, and inhabited by people oddly similar to her in a myriad of ways. All of this raises questions. What really happened to Takako and Sachiko, and what's the real nature of their disorders? Why do the two seem as if they're living in distant yet overlapping worlds, grieving each other despite being so close? And what does it mean to move on from a past love and the loss of what you once treasured? Somewhere between these two conflicting realities are truths and memories that explain what's really happened, and questions about what it means to love, to grieve, to live, to die, and to know a world beyond an objective truth. I say this every couple of videos, but SeaBed is a game that really does not want to be synopsized. Practically every part of it is fighting that, from the often dry and highly descriptive narration to how it's structured like a series of disorganized memories told from multiple conflicting perspectives, to the aimlessness of numerous scenes, to the writing itself keeping a flat line of tension all throughout. In a practical sense, its design makes it hard to characterize as the paranormal mystery Yuri that it gets described as, even though it is technically that. There's paranormal elements of ideas of exploring the afterlife, there's an overarching mystery about what happened to the couple and what's real or fake, and there's romance with the relationship between Sachiko and Takako being a core element of the narrative, but all of it feels like a byproduct of that narrative rather than the explicit intention. None of these free aspects, nor any others, are given particular attention throughout. They're just things that happen to occur in the middle of these characters living out and trying to make sense of their lives, given as much detail and focus as the grain on a plank of wood or the architecture of a building, all described in a very objective, scientific way, in as far as an individual can be objective anyways. Which is fascinating because that emphasis of detail highlights how plain everything is here. The game takes place in Japan during the 1970s through to around the very early 90s, with old-fashioned phones and computers abound, and the atmosphere is as yearningly nostalgic for those times as the characters themselves often are for further back in the past. The style of writing actually helps to make this setting and realism approachable for those who don't know anything about it. Having extra context definitely helps, but whatever you need to know that's relevant to the characters and progress of the story is told directly to you, either by that prose or by naturally flowing dialogue between characters. With 10 in total, SeaBed has a fairly large cast for a 20 to 25 hour game, let alone a doujin title, though 3 are given focus above all others, starting with Mizuno Sachiko. Quiet, hardworking, and often flat in her affectation, she's your typical overworked late 20s office lady lesbian who struggles to show her emotions, but never fails to give an aura of caring to those around her. Her characterization is very accurate to all the people I've known like that, down to being inexplicably charming. She's so incredibly flat in many ways that things such as her endearingly strong interest in books, detailed way of thinking conveyed through prose, occasional smile, and ability to banter stand out even more, painting a clear picture as to why someone like her partner fell in love with her. Takako is a total contrast to everything Sachiko is. She's introduced as a far more peppy and comedic person, the kind to do cartwheels on the beach and have an almost reckless disregard for her own safety. That's not to say she doesn't also have her quiet, contemplative side though, because she does, and it's regularly demonstrated, as does Sachiko have a more playful side. Together, they loosely fit into the quiet one and the loud one couple trope, but only in as much as that loosely exists in reality, because they do show a whole wide variety of mannerisms, and they're just a joy to watch on screen. Of equal importance to the main couple is Narasaki Hibiki, friend of Sachiko since childhood who briefly knew Takako, and a psychiatrist working at her own clinic who's taken a keen interest in Sachiko's odd disorder. She's mature and kind, the ideal psych in many ways, but she's also an oddly secretive person, not always willing to disclose what she knows or explain things in a complete way. She is by far the most elusive character in the game and one crucial to the mystery in impressively well foreshadowed ways. Though these three are the main driving force of the story, the rest of the cast is given just as much importance as them. Sachiko's co-workers, Fumi and Takehiko, both play really well off of her and each other, getting involved in charmingly silly arguments at the office as much as they help each other out, and the inhabitants of the nursing home which Takako is staying at, as well as the inn which Sachiko is staying at, are all well-rounded and a joy to watch. On Takako's side, Kozue is probably my favorite of the bunch. She's a bratty and closeted high schooler who slowly begins opening up to Takako and the others as the game goes on, progressing from a fun highlight of any scene she's in to openly caring and loving by the end. Nanae as well, on Sachiko's side of things, plays off Sachiko in ways strikingly similar to Takako while still being her own person, especially with her tendency to give massive info dumps about things like gardening and architecture. The way the writing gives all dialogue and actions evenly in-depth attention leads to these characters feeling much more human, real, and difficult to define in terms of roles in most stories. Interactions that most fiction would cut for brevity, like those aforementioned info dumps, are left intact here and give a lot of room for each of the cast members to show their unique quirks and develop engaging chemistry with each other. It's especially interesting given how atypical a lot of them are for a visual novel and how all of them are treated as just people. Multiple characters deal with disabilities in an empathetic light that shows them finding plenty of joy and happiness despite the struggles, and the social status of characters varies from teen in school to working class and interrelationship lesbian. That last part particularly surprised me because visual novels as a genre are known for preferring school settings and straight characters if age is ambiguous or explicitly under their mid-20s. If a game bucks this trend, it's probably because it's already deviating from the norm in some way. I've covered many games with non-cishet, non-perfectly abled characters on this channel, but basically all of them were being marketed as some form of niche horror already. SeaBed, on the other hand, while definitely offbeat, strays away from having any grotesque adult scenes, hell, it doesn't even have any, as well as never showing the viewer disturbing imagery on controversial topics. While the writing and formatting of the story might be abrasive to some, what it goes into hardly is, and it still manages to have a cast of people primarily in their mid to late 20s with no particularly exciting quirks or lives. They're just people, humanized for showing their daily lives in full detail, and I do mean full. SeaBed very much has an intentional disregard for meaning and pace. That's not to say it doesn't have those things, it's a work rich in metaphor and theming, and it does have incredibly deliberate pacing, but all of it is achieved through things that most writing teachers and publishers would deem antithetical to those, and subsequently throw out a window. I mentioned multiple times earlier that everything in the story is given even focus, and that manifests in meandering conversations, prose of unimportant minute details, and all that would logically occur within a scene from a given POV being noted in some shape or form. Like life, there isn't any clear purpose to what you're seeing a lot of the time, besides what you bestow upon it. And that's kind of the opposite of how a lot of writing and interpretation is supposed to work, isn't it? We're primed to try and find meaning and purpose in whatever artists are trying to show us, because creating art is a deliberate effort that takes time, and it's an effort that you will inevitably put yourself into. What you choose to write about and how you write about it reflects what you find important within yourself, whether that's deliberate or not. Conversely, stuff just sort of happens in SeaBed, and all of it feels like it's asking the viewer to either make their meaning out of it or just vibe. Anything here that moves the plot forward or carries symbolic purpose exists because it's something that could reasonably come up in the midst of all the other stuff that's just there because it is. A monologue about death has the same narrative weight as a screen worth of text on the process of brewing coffee. The primary result of this is a story that lacks induced tension, defined peaks and valleys, and character roles. There are no antagonists here, no shadow corporations, no secret plots, none of that. Everyone here is an average person of complexity we know exists but will never fully understand, and none of them are working to sabotage the other or anything like that. They don't have any reason to, and they don't have anything externally threatening them. Because of this flow, all the tension that exists within the story feels really natural and not like the story is structured specifically to induce that in you. The way I reacted to subtle reveals in the mystery, uncomfortably familiar character interactions, and even small moments of fleeting joy felt like my reactions and not what the author was looking for. It makes the story feel deeply personal, and that matters a lot for exploring the concepts of grief that it seems interested in. Both Takako and Sachiko are struggling struggling with the loss of the one they loved most, and both navigate it very differently due to their circumstances and mental well-being. Satsuko is plagued by hallucinations as she attempts to reconcile with what her life means after losing Takako, and Takako finds her memory rapidly dwindling at the same time as she starts developing feelings for one of the women in the nursing home. Navigating the grief of a loved one she can't even remember while her heart starts yearning elsewhere is painful and challenging, but the writing's flat pace makes it clear it's only one part of the life she's moving through. The grief and processing changes throughout the entire game for both of them, some days being the only thing they think about and others not even occurring. There's a vivid picture painted here of the world that each of our protagonists experience, lovingly reflected on in a spontaneous and chaotic way. Beautiful vacations to parts of Europe, quiet moments of bonding after class, sleepy mornings getting ready for work. It's something that can really put you in a sort of zen state if you're able to vibe with it. And the game does its best to try and ask readers to go along with that flow and achieve that zen state, bouncing between 3 different POVs, 2 lovers as well as Narasaki later on, in a way that sort of obscures the overall narrative if you're thinking too hard about it, but it just sort of clicks when you take everything for what it is. In other words, if you try to see SeaBed as a traditional story, you're gonna have a hard time, but if you see it as a journey without worry for an end, then it's easy to come along. By the time the credits rolled, I felt like I didn't really need a resolution to many of the questions I had in my head, nor the kind of catharsis I usually expect from a story. The flatlining of tension and detail allows the chaotic structure to work and shift the focus of the narrative away from closure and clear purpose, away from viewing Sachiko and Takako as objects within a tale, and instead as people with humanity. That is one of the things SeaBed ultimately seems to want to emphasize, and I think it makes their love and the difficulties surrounding their lives feel a lot more real as a result. You don't care about these two because you're chomping at the bit to see what happens next, you care about these two because you've seen how wonderful their journeys can be and how beautiful a couple they are. It's able to leverage all of these storytelling quirks to keep the reader invested in the characters and subsequently the mystery without over or underwhelming them, further spurred on by the computerized elements of it. Like, make no mistake, SeaBed is not a sprawling adventure game, it's a straight shot from beginning to end with no choices like a paperback novel. But unlike a paperback novel, it uses visuals and sounds to hint at things subtly in ways that words can't, and brings up new questions and complexities for the use of so-called hints, instead of free, isolated storylines that unlock slowly as you progress through the game, available to read at any time you choose. It makes the story feel like something you can't just solve by going from beginning to end. You need to make the conscious choice to interact with more of it and be given more to think on. And that very specific type of drive towards asking for audience participation and thought feels antithetical to art as a consumable in the modern era. People will do absolutely everything they can to avoid dreaming for themselves about what's presented to them, and instead try to find clear answers, meaning, and purpose in it, not from themselves, but from the authors. This is something I've thought a lot about recently, particularly as it pertains to how people talk about more abstract works like Twin Peaks. For those of you who haven't watched it, I'm currently transmitting the entire show to you by Dempo Waves. Pew! But for those who can't receive them, Twin Peaks is a media series spearheaded by Mark Frost and David Lynch, noted not only for basically creating the modern film-like episodic drama as we know it, but also for things like its penchant towards open-ended mysteries, surrealist imagery, and a large body of diverse and highly interpretable ideas. I saw it with my boyfriend for the first time recently after it came up in some videos we were watching, and it's wedged its way into my brain permanently. Not just because the show itself is deeply thought-provoking and fascinating, but because the discourse around it bounces between wild and enjoyable theorizing that shows immense creativity and personal drive, and people being extremely desperate to have a solid logic and explanation for all that happens in this so they can develop a central core idea of what was supposedly intended. And I think that's antithetical to what makes Twin Peaks so interesting. It's a series about how the veils of perfection around small communities are little more than mirages that people are desperate to protect. It's a series about how people handle grief in the face of conflicting knowledge about a person. It's a series about how Cooper is the most moe man in existence. And it's a series about the balance between dark and light in our world, among so many other things like spirituality and coffee.
A damn fine cup of coffee.
I could go on forever about my different interpretations of events and parts of the show that stuck out to me and their reactions to them in culture. I could write an entire essay about why Fire Walk With Me is maybe my favorite film and how fascinatingly in-depth and relatable the character of Laura Palmer is as a portrait of an abused teenage woman struggling to survive in this world. Nobody is going to walk away from Twin Peaks taking the same things away from it, and that's why I despise the desperation some people have to define it in singular objective terms, to connect every dot and solve every mystery to find the right interpretation, substituting emotional vulnerability and connection for an objective truth, in spite of the series going into countless topics that beg the viewer to dream. Don't get me wrong, Twin Peaks definitely has a lot of concrete elements in it that you can connect together, and I think there's a coherent story once you stop to think about and discuss it. But those concrete and objective parts are surrounded by bizarre events and abstract concepts and goofy shenanigans that feel nigh undefinable in literal terms, and the clash of those two parts are where the series truly shines.
There was a fish in the percolator.
Its greatest strength is in how that undefinability requires you, as the viewer, to connect with it and connect the dots however you're going to connect them. And similarly, I think SeaBed asks much the same. There's many concrete ideas in here, but they're coded in inexplicable and oftentimes pointless things. It asks you to reconcile between these two and accept that anything you come up with about its offense is ultimately just your machinations. As a video essayist who dislikes the modern focus on author intention, that kind of permission slip feels as valuable as a diamond. I will speak time and time again on how I see art as a dialogue between creator and interpreter, and I have a lot of gripes with how much of the discourse online about themes and ideas within a work turn into discussions on whether or not the creator is a morally upright person, usually according to Puritan ideals that have their origin in patriarchal religion, capitalism, and sex negativity. Also, I only realized at the last minute of editing that I should put this footnote here, but I want to clarify I'm not saying the character of an artist doesn't matter. Like any people, they should be held accountable when they expose harmful rhetoric and commit awful misdeeds. But art from a bad person has meaning for many, and I think it's far more productive to have discussions where the artist as a person, their intended meaning, and how that art has been received culturally and personally intersect without judging people. Just going, they're bad, so you're bad for liking something they made is extremely reductive and prevents any sort of discussion that we need to have about morality and people and politics and art. Anyways. But my problems with how viewer interpretation is treated as a lesser thing by some go deeper than frustration of petty Twitter arguments over the morality of people engaging with the wrong things or the right things wrong. To be clear, author intention matters, and even the most radical and rebellious of takes are ultimately still informed by it to some extent. A rebellion needs a thing to rebel against, after all. But it isn't the ultimate authority, and treating it such at the cost of ignoring how people subjectively interpret and read into aspects of art means ignoring the beauty and the feelings of people, how people imbue art with their own deep and personal meaning to add even more layers and wonder to something. A show can go from mid to kino just by hearing a bro's feelings out and accepting his view as valid. Maybe that bro's feelings are far off from what the author intended, but just like you, the author is a mere person, not an art cop. You don't have to abide by everything they say. I have a lot of respect for how SeaBed presents the reader with clear ideas, but does so organically, asking you to be the one who figures out what those mean. I found nothing but a sea of unfamiliar kanji in the discussions of trees and plants, but maybe you'll see symbolism where I didn't. I found deep empathy and portrayals of particular mental health topics, but maybe you'll find complementary insights into love and spirituality that I didn't catch elsewhere. Resolution and catharsis are about the only two things you can't find for certain here, which are the two hardest things to accept very well may not exist. I called the game abrasive earlier, and I did so lovingly, but I choose to cop that word from friends of mine describing the game with a purpose. SeaBed is not your typical piece of fiction, and it will do everything in its power to try and stop you from simply consuming it. All of this adds up to creating an experience that I think is not just distinctly different from any other VN I've read, but most fiction too, especially anime. Everything from all the storytelling ideas I've just outlined, down to the way the characters themselves are painted so realistically and caringly, leads to a work that dodges practically every stereotype of Japanese media imaginable. In this way, I think SeaBed is actually a great VN to hand to people who like complex and unique literature, but either aren't familiar at all with VNs and anime, or have a misconception that's all bountiful booby skull romances and hyperviolence. I love those things, but I also love a story that can opt to try and show life for what it is and all its undefinable mundane detail. All that said, there are still a lot of ways SeaBed is at least a little typical of a VN, and one of the most apparent is within the artwork. Like a lot of independently produced titles, it opts to use anime-styled sprite art layered on top of filtered photographs and 3D backgrounds. What strikes me the most though is just how the backgrounds are actually able to make an overall coherent aesthetic with the anime art. Most of the time when indie VNs try this look, you can tell it's out of budget constraints. All the different aspects clash of a bizarre dissonance that you start to accept with time, but doesn't entirely go away. And I don't think this is any fault of indie developers, because let's be completely fair, developing a game is really hard, and taking shortcuts wherever possible so you don't burn out and implode is actually good. But it does undeniably affect how the end product looks, which is why I was really surprised when SeaBed managed to do this aesthetic in a very cohesive way. The filtered photographs and 3D renders feel grounded yet surreal, and the sprites themselves have such a sketchy, blotchy look to their line art and shading that they fit right in with the pseudo oil painting look of the backgrounds and cohere with the writing. The end result is a perfectly formulated aesthetic. It's rough in all the right places to feel scrappy and homebrewed, but with a sort of cohesion that even many big budget VNs struggle to achieve. That same level of effort can be felt in the staging as well. Characters are bouncy and expressive with clear purpose, subtle details are conveyed only visually and brilliantly at that, scenes shift in a comprehensible and clear manner despite the game's chaotic structure. The CGs aren't to be underestimated either. The framing and photography within them is at the least functional and pleasant, and at the far more common best, incredibly evocative and emotional, capturing a feeling of wistful joy with apparent ease. There's also a ton of them, over 70 in total, which is incredible for a retail release of this length, let alone an independent work. I also have to say I adore the character designs. Each is distinct from the other without feeling absurd and out of this world. The characters look like office ladies and doctors and nurses and generally just like average people, even if some of them look like they haven't aged since their late teens. As someone who's used to getting carded and side-eyed when I just want to buy a bottle of whiskey though, I'm not one to talk. Lastly, on the note of art, I need to at least briefly mention the two versions of this game. SeaBed was initially released at a Doujin event into DL site in 2015, with the game running at the resolution of 800 by 600. This is the version that I played for reasons I will mention very shortly, but the one that most are going to want is the 2017 release available on most digital storefronts, which runs in letterbox 1080p with appropriately higher resolution assets. It looks a lot nicer than the original release, though I also sort of like how crunchy the OG is. The newer release, though, unfortunately, also did not play nice with any text hooking software I could find, and the load of unfamiliar nouns in the game challenged my reading fairly often, so that's why I stuck with the small version. If you're a Japanese learner and have issues getting the HD game to work, then you should check the version on DL site. And if you're a native level speaker of your language of choice, then just the HD release works. You should still check out that DL site sponsor though, there are plenty of things to use that coupon on besides this. Regardless of my text hooking woes, those indie doujin game vibes also extend to the music. SeaBed's soundtrack is entirely constructed out of royalty-free tracks taken from various corners of the internet by way too many artists to name, and yet it is all chosen with a deliberate idea of what the soundscape should sound like. And I mean all of it. All 63 tracks. I complain a lot about music repetition and eroge on this channel, but suffice to say that number completely circumvents the problem. The background music is never repetitive, but it's got a clear sense for placement and theming too. You'll hear the same tunes from time to time when it's relevant, but you'll also be hearing new ones up until the very end to keep things fresh. Normally I'm very critical when it comes to using stock music in VNs, but I have nothing but good things to say about how SeaBed does it. What is a bit more of a divisive thing though is the lack of voice acting. There is none here, a fairly common thing for doujin releases, but a bit surprising to have never been added in any future updates. Whether you play on Switch or PC, from the original DL site release or the higher resolution remaster on Steam, the music and shockingly great sound effects are the only thing you're going to be hearing. There is some thematic point to this, and I don't want to make it sound like a deal breaker, as for many scenes it's generally not that hard to follow so long as you pay attention to speech mannerisms and sprite animation. But it is nevertheless something that stood out to me in this title due to the usage of the novel display style rather than the typical ADV text box of nameplate. This is something that gets a bit further complicated in the English translation as well, which, to be completely clear, I think is an all-around fine translation that's gotten better over the years, and I can easily recommend playing the game this way without hesitation. But I personally found character voicing to feel less defined on the whole, and the prose felt far too literal. SeaBed is a game with prose that feels very scientific and objective despite the subjective nature of the narration that's core to its being, but it does so in a way that's really smooth and easily induces a hypnotic trance while reading. The English translation does get this idea across well enough, but the overuse of passive voice and almost too blunt of prose at times made it harder for me to get into a flow. But again, I don't say this to call the translation bad, it's a fine work overall, and my gripes don't even seem to be a blip on the radar of most readers, which is good because SeaBed is a story I want people to read. It's a deeply resonant piece of fiction for how it goes against writing traditions in order to portray a legitimately captivating portrait of the lives of its cast, exploring what it means to live with grief and accept reality for all its subjectivity. And to finally explore this in more depth, I'm going to be diving deep into spoiler territory, so if you don't want to have the major twists of the game revealed to you, then skip ahead to the end segment where I give my closing thoughts. But first, you should stick around for the Patreon bit where I thank all the cool people who make this possible and shout out some folks that you should watch. Howdy ho, Edo gamers, and wait, no, this isn't Edo gay, I can't say that. Howdy ho, regular gamers, and welcome to the Patreon segment, that part of the video where I give life and channel updates, thank the donors who make this all possible, and shout out cool people that you should watch. For the first of those, as usual, well, like last video, I've been sick for a lot of production of this since whatever flu I got ended up causing another illness that I'm just finally coming back from. Though I am currently still having issues hearing in one of my ears, which I have a doctor's appointment for, but if I sound a bit odd voicing this video over, yeah, that's why. Kinda rough timing too, given that the entire time I've been working on this video, I've also been knee-deep in dealing with immigration and visa stuff for life in Brazil. That all has been going well, but trying to juggle it along with my lungs wanting to hop out of my body, along with making a video, has been a massive load on my mind that I'm happy is looking to be over soon. The channel side of things has been pretty chill though. Focusing on just shorter games and videos for now, looking at more varied titles than just horror, has been a welcome break that's allowed me to explore new topics and old ones alike in fresh ways. The Patreon hovering around $2 grand is made for comfortable living here in Sao Paulo that I am extremely grateful for. Y'all are so wonderful for making these videos possible as a career of a livable wage, so Thank you so much! And as per usual, I'd like to take a moment to shout out some cool folks from this community who've pitched their work, people I've stumbled upon, and neato things I've been told about. And if you would also like a chance to be shouted out, then feel free to drop me a line via Twitter, Tumblr, or Patreon DMs. I am always looking for new stuff to give well-deserved attention to. The first person I'd like to shout out is Blue, a YouTuber who makes video essays diving into various games and topics of game history. It's possible you may have actually seen some of his videos around already, given a handful of his essays have cracked over 100,000 views and beyond. And while those are great, I want to give special attention to the ones that haven't been so successful. His video documenting the history of Metroid SR3D8, an attempt at remaking Metroid 2 that very few people remember, is a fantastic dive into all the lore surrounding an unreleased game that I actually remembered being excited for at one point when I was young and then forgot once it faded from the limelight. And understanding what actually happened to that game, delivered with slick editing, great scripting, and a smooth voiceover, was an absolute treat. On the whole, Blue's videos are absolutely fantastic and full of wonderful effort. The fact that only some have reached the success they deserve while many stay buried is a serious shame. So if you got the time to spare and an interest in neat gaming history, then I would highly recommend taking a peek at his stuff. It is well worth your time. What I'd like to shout out next is not a person, but a collection of cool stuff. The Menheta Game Jam. Hosted by Nadia Nova, a cool person who's previously been shouted out here before, the jam collects 49 highly creative games themed around queer characters dealing with mental health, including titles by many good friends of mine. This Superficial World by Castell, Hollow Hearts by Mismatched Wings. There's plenty of creative and fascinating titles that I've hardly scratched the surface of, but I'm excited to dig more into and wholeheartedly encourage y'all to explore. Maybe I'll do a video talk about some of them at some point. And that is almost all for now. I do, however, want to go into a question that quite a few viewers asked on Patreon recently, which I think I've answered before, maybe not, I don't know, it's hard to keep track of this stuff sometimes, but will I cover niche non-VN Japanese media or non-Japanese VN and adventure game media? And the answer to both of those is yes, if it strikes my fancy and if I'm able. I'm actually considering doing a video on a game by Suda51 at some point this year, likely Flower, Sun, and Rain, as that is a super fascinating game, as far as I can tell, and it also has a messy localization. Anywho, now we are actually wrapped up. As always, I have to give a massive thank you to the donors who make this possible. Being able to make a living wage off these videos is a blessing that I don't at all take for granted. It's because of you all that I've been able to make it out to somewhere I'm happy and safe, work on living in another country that isn't miserable like the US often is and continues to seem to be, and I'm not looking forward to the election. And I can create these videos without being beholden to the draconian policies of YouTube's sponsorship system. And if you too would like to support these videos in my crusade to preach the good word of sometimes gay and almost always quirky Japanese media, get your name on the side of the screen like all these cool people scrolling by. Submit questions, just games, get monthly updates, watch without censors, and sometimes watch videos early, then consider supporting my work on Ko-fi or Patreon. Minimum is a single US dollar a month and all content is accessible by all amounts. And if you prefer to keep watching for free, that is totally fine. Like I always say, liking and sharing and subscribing and commenting all do a lot to make these videos possible, and I would not be able to do them without all your combined efforts and kindness. So again, thank you all so much, and let's get back to the show. SeaBed is somewhat infamously a challenging game to write about in depth, and as such I'm going to be doing very little actual summarizing here, and instead focus on the vibes and my personal feelings on what the work presents. Not only does that feel more honest to what the game seems to want, but if I didn't do so, then this segment would be about as long as the basic summary I'm about to give for context. The rough story is something as follows. Sachiko and Takako were two lesbian lovers since childhood, but soon before the start of the game, Takako passed away and left Sachiko struggling with grief, eventually resulting in hallucinations of her past love. She goes to a European inn run by a friend of hers, Nanae, to try and de-stress, and we as players learn that inn is suspiciously similar to a nursing home that Takako is supposedly staying at, in complete contradiction to her supposedly being dead. And there, Takako becomes close with the various residents who are oddly similar to Sachiko in some ways, and struggles with a condition that causes her to slowly lose her memory accompanied by spasms, with the only advice given to her in order to keep track of her memories being to journal her daily life. It is, after all, her finding a mysterious journal within the nursing home, seemingly written by Sachiko, that is able to actually jog her memory. After many days of reading and growing close to the clinic's inhabitants, as well as many parallel days of Sachiko becoming closer with the innkeeper Nanae and consulting of Narasaki, we learn that these two locations are genuinely linked, as the nursing home exists within Sachiko's subconscious. It's somewhere she can't interact with, but nevertheless has an effect on her daily life, as this seems to be the way that she works for her grief. Narasaki has been aware of this the entire time because she isn't actually independent being, but a part of Sachiko's mind capable of acting without her direct involvement, able to travel between the conscious and subconscious to ferry information around, and even take over for Sachiko, as shown in her POV scenes where she interacts with the real world. Maybe her most important action, though, is being the one who got Sachiko's journal over to Takako in order to remind her of the Sachiko she knew, rather than inform Takako directly and taint her perspective. Using her power, she grants the Forlorn couple one final conversation with each other, bridging the two parts of her mind for long enough to at least be able to catch up a bit, even if they can't say goodbye to each other and give full closure. It's from here that Sachiko begins to heal further, and as for Takako's condition, the only thing left to do is write. Even if it's only once every so often, even if it's only things that are big, they will never forget each other so as long as there's something to remember each other by. And so, Takako sails on a journey with her friends, and thus ends SeaBed. And that is more or less the entire mystery of SeaBed condensed into a few paragraphs. At least it's my interpretation of it and what other people have come away with. It's also horrendously void of the detail and context that makes this game so interesting, because so many of the most memorable moments in it go absolutely nowhere. Like, for instance, the innkeep Nanae at one point confesses her drunken love to Sachiko and goes on this really prescient ramble that I'll come back to a bit later. Where does that fit with anything I just summarized? I have no idea, because not only does it do absolutely nothing to move the story forward, but it has barely any long-term effects on the feelings of Sachiko and Nanae's character. Hell, the entire character of Nanae could be removed from the plot without fundamentally changing the mystery or altering Sachiko's character too much. The solution to the mystery and the plot as I describe it is only to make a base for what else I'm going to talk about and all the disparate scenes that I bring together, because SeaBed is not about solutions, endings, and catharsis. The game itself actively denies the player the sort of closure they may expect, because in my view, SeaBed is about how grief never ends. While many people who've gone through it can probably understand how permanent the feelings it brings can be, I feel like the general conception in society is that grief has a time, a place, and a method, all according to what it is you're grieving. People broadly understand that the loss of a loved one can hurt for days, weeks, even months, but at some point you're expected to just move past it and go forward. Party with your friends, get a new hobby, and suddenly it'll be behind you. I have experienced this myself on numerous occasions. I think the one that sticks in my mind the most was the aftermath of being sexually assaulted. The people I was around were understanding for a month or two that I was depressed and aimless as I tried to cope, but some of the things I found solace in or avoided were considered bizarre, and there reached a point where I was actively upsetting to others. I couldn't bring myself to just be fine. It didn't make sense to some that I'd be knocked out for this long, but my mind was stuck in this feeling that I had lost something that I didn't even know I had. Was it innocence? Sanctity? I still don't know. Well, I can say at this point I'm over that phase of the grief. The effects of it still echo in my mind from time to time. Scenes of sexual assault in media carry a completely new meaning to me and can sometimes be triggering. I flinch more at certain words and mannerisms that remind me of the past, and I still yearn from time to time for the days where I didn't know the kinds of pains I know now. In a social sense, I've stopped grieving, but in a personal sense, I'm still going through it, and I always will be. SeaBed is maybe the only piece of media I've seen that understands this pain, and a lot of it is owed to how much it denies the reader catharsis and resolution. The very last conversation in the game between Bakugo and Sachiko doesn't let their relationship end despite it being over in a social sense. The two don't break up or give each other up because their lives have been permanently altered by each other. Sachiko's mind can never fully let Bakugo go. She will always be grieving her loss. This is expressed in the game for exploring what actually constitutes the loss of life. Objectively, on some level, no one has ever gone for good. The corpses and ashes of the deceased fertilize the earth and stay in its memory forever. Objects that we experience as related to that person often far outlive said person. But none of those things are actually that person, just fragments of them we can't converse with or reach conclusions with except by ourselves and our conscious and subconscious. And what good can we do with that? This is what I see that whole subconscious world thing is representing. Bakugo might be physically gone, and maybe in the years since her passing, Sachiko has reached a level of solace that lets her specter hide for the most part. But times of great stress or reminders of her existence cause that specter of grief looming over Sachiko to come out of the shadows and need reconciliation. All she can do to work through it when it does come up is let her mind process the emotions in the background, occasionally leaking into the foreground. And how do you work with something that's too gone to perceive in anything but your own mind in fragmented detail? How do you move past something that your mind refuses to let disappear in full but is impossible to interact with? It's a process that looks different for everybody because everybody experiences grief differently and grieves different things, which I think is another place where SeaBed's vagueness and lack of conclusions really becomes an emotional tour de force. The aimless narrative highlights the constant sense of yearning in its characters for what once was and what could have been. happen, the kind of specters that have been looming over my life for as long as I can remember. I grew up as a trans child, denied healthcare early on, and as a child forced to more or less raise myself and others at the same time. Distanced from it all, and finally in somewhere truly safe for the first time, I've realized that I've never actually had the chance to sit back and understand just how much pain and grief I'd felt over everything I was denied and wished for. Being more comfortable now has incidentally led to the discovery of further and further layers of things which I'm only now learning I have to deal with. Things that many people don't even believe need dealing with. After all, I'm in a materially fine situation. I'm on hormones pretty happily and very consistently. I experience almost no dysphoria. So what does all that past dysphoria and neglect matter? Is it acceptable for me to even grieve something so long gone? Being empathetic to myself and others in those situations, as I believe is right to be, I think it is. Life for many people, especially many with queer identities, is a process of constant grieving over almost every aspect of our lives. The opportunities we've been denied, the ways we've been manipulated and abused, the comforts and rights taken from us, the depth of that happiness is as right to grieve as anything else. And SeaBed, as I see it, says that whatever you're grieving, you're doing so for a reason. And however your feelings manifest have reason as well. Narasaki says as much early on in the game, and not in any sort of religious God has a plan for you type of way. Rather, it's because our feelings and symptoms of distress don't exist without some sort of origin, whether directly observable or subjectively experienced, which I think was once captured by one author perfectly 40 years ago now.
Our subjective experience of the world tells us the truth about it, even if the language it has to use to do so is cast in forms we have come to see as symptoms. We live in anxiety, fear, and dread because these constitute a proper response to the nature of our social world, and if we continue not to take account of the message they give us, we shall make it even more impossible than it has already become to act upon the reality that threatens to imprison and destroy us. So far, however, we have met the challenge of our experience by ever more feverish attempts to objectify ourselves.
That quote is from David Smail's 1984 book, Illusion and Reality, who was responding to a time in Western society where most psychotherapy was focused on correcting patients, turning them into a list of symptoms to check off, rather than viewing their problems as a result of someone's very unnatural emotions and desires being denied and broken by past traumas and the prevailing myths of society, distilled to us through the machine-like apparatus of systems like capitalism. That feels like a pretty common take now, but it's one that plenty of therapists still don't share. Even now, the book feels absurdly prescient for something released in the year of our George Lordwell 1984, and its core question is one that I feel is still worth asking. Is normal okay? Like, is a society that asks us to operate like machines, that's laden with roles that cause most people immense anxiety to abide by, that requires us to dull ourselves to be acceptable, and excuse inhumane torture of ourselves and others, okay? As I've outlined in tons of my prior videos, no, normal is actually pretty bad, and even if you think you're benefiting from it, you're not. I entirely agree with Narasaki that Sachiko's seeing hallucinations that she's aware of as such that don't cause her or those around her agony are just parts of her grieving and a sign that she needs to take time away from work and society, not drown herself further in the machine, hoping to appease some sense of mythical correctness. Trying to run away from these symptoms and suppress them rather than work to heal these struggling parts of herself is just going to hurt more in the long run and stifle the grieving process. That process might not align with others' reality precisely at times, but isn't grief a personal, unique process anyways? One that's always changing and, as I've outlined, without end? Smail argues in his book that the more we try to objectify ourselves and our experiences into a concrete, universal idea of a human experience, like a psychiatrist of old may have done with a checklist, the more we erase the subjectivity and complexity of the human experience from ourselves. And trying to concretely explain everything about ourselves and others, quote, we inadvertently deny them the significance of their own experience, and in trying to replace their bitter knowledge of a cruel world with belief in the myths we would prefer to be true, we do them, perhaps, the greatest violence of all, end quote. We would prefer it to be true that grieving what we've lost, yearning for what could have been, is a process that comes and goes in a brief flash. We tell ourselves stories of this, of characters channeling their pain in the field to go forward, then solving their emotions for a story beat of incredible catharsis and resolution that allows them to move forward stronger than ever before. And while there is some truth in there, it's not the end of the story. Grief has as much power to allow us to grow stronger as it does to make our worlds freeze and become unrecognizable from what we once knew. Specters of our past dance around us and monochromize everything we see, causing us to see traces traits of those we once loved and those we come to know, visions of our past and only tangentially related presents. Even when Sachiko isn't seeing the visions of Takako, she still sees Takako and people like Nanae, at times remarking on just how similar the two are, and the two have some genuinely incredible chemistry that results from it. It's what eventually leads Nanae to drunkenly confess in that scene I mentioned before, which is honestly one of my favorite moments in the game for how uncomfortable it is, contrary to most of the rest of the experience. Nanae's confession is messy and incoherent in true bumbling lesbian fashion, riddled with weird metaphors about emotional compatibility and ramblings that simultaneously add on to and conflict with the messaging about the permanence of life. There's a line in it that I didn't even pay attention to at first, but games blogger Pete Davidson did, that's now etched in my mind. Quote, "You can think all you want, but feelings without a target are hardly different from feelings that don't exist at all," end quote. In a way, it goes against the idea that things never really disappear, but it also enhances it by highlighting a contradictory complexity within grief. It is this almost intangible yearning for an almost intangible thing. It can be a swirling mess of untargeted feelings that feel nightmares to try and give concrete meaning and origin to, and the world generally doesn't want to recognize the strain of this dichotomy on the mind and soul. Work might give you a few days of leave if you're lucky, but you're going to be expected to come back on the 5th even though your mind can't move past the 1st. People will let you have space for a bit, but many become upset when you lack desire to see them on their terms. And though you may see the one you loved everywhere in mundane things, others will deny you the ability to do so, to avoid confronting their own grief, to avoid confronting that the world isn't so objective and explicable. Part of what I find fascinating in SeaBed is that it allows its couples places to live without ignoring their troubles in whatever way they may come to them. Takako's point of view is of particular note with this because none of it actually takes place in normal reality. Inside Sachiko's subconscious, uninterrupted by society and its expectations, she's allowed to talk with and learn from vestiges of Sachiko's past, stare at butterflies and ponder philosophy, and talk one last time to Sachiko with the help of Narasaki. She's an especially important figure in Sachiko's side of the narrative, as her existence arguably represents an empathetic, encouraging fragment of her mind. Not a real person, she's instead a manifestation in Sachiko's mind of a doll that she and Takako used to play doctor with growing up, now encouraging her to try and take care of herself and accept what can help her go through the healing process. She's the character who offers a lot of the ideas for what comes after death to her, including one of my favorite lines, remarking on how even those who have passed live on within the earth itself. There's a lot of things you can do, even after you become ash, she muses before the conversation ends without closure. I think what makes this overall lack of catharsis work is that SeaBed isn't pessimistic about it. By allowing the world to exist without artificial tension and the characters to live their lives as they naturally would, you get to see how accepting the eternality of grief doesn't mean everything else in the world fades away. The pleasure of the most mundane, even without the beautifying and exaggerating lens an Iyashike story has, can lend a sort of zen state simply by paying attention to all the subtleties. Isn't it nice how green and pointed those blades of grass are, the same you see every day, the scent of coffee freshly ground every morning, the texture of that refined wood, smooth yet rugged. Those are all things we notice subconsciously and can be a real joy to pay attention to. Trying to find and admire details you hadn't before in the things that still exist is soothing. With every new thing I lose, every new step I take in the never-ending journey of grieving what's gone, I find my view of the world and what I notice in these kinds of things changing. In a time of fear and loss, the familiar scent of the coffee I grind goes from a mundanity to a complex dance of scents, bitter and sweet, strong and weak. The movements of my body go from subconscious actions to carefully defined physical movements, finding details in myself that I never thought about before. How you experience the world and what you find in it is subjective and ever-changing, and nobody can define that for you. It's part of why I so strongly reject trying to make a single reading of a work like Twin Peaks or SeaBed and close it off there. I love reading about this game and seeing people's experiences with it because they always have some different things they click with, or have some reaction to something that I never even thought about. People take ideas and information and spin it in different ways, and that alone I feel is proof enough that trying to wholly objectivize the human experience and what we create is an effort without end. I'm not saying you can interpret everything in the world however you want and it's all valid, because there are a lot of truths we find by repeated experimentation and observation. That's what science as a field is. But science and all truth is something that just exists in the present tense. Simply because we have a working theory for the base mechanics of disease doesn't mean that we can't later find something even more basic, or more basic than that. I had a discussion about this sort of thing with my boyfriend a couple days ago as I write this, who, for context, is an incredibly talented mathematician, well-read person, in general is just a very good boy, but those two traits I mentioned are specifically relevant here because the discussion was about the basic truths of mathematics. There's something called Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which states that it's impossible to make a complete set of axioms, self-evident statements, that can prove all of mathematics. In other terms, a set of axioms B can justify things C through Z, but you need A to justify B. And if you did somehow construct A, like B, it can't prove itself, so we're in the same situation. The point point of this isn't to go all postmodern nihilist and say nothing matters or is true, but that there's a point where you have to use your own judgment, knowledge, and feelings to determine whether or not something is true or false, regardless of provability. As a generally open-minded trans person, all of this feels very intuitive. I'm used to accepting that I have to come to my own conclusions about what base truths about gender and identity and sexuality, or far more accurately social myths as Smale would put it, are and aren't correct, only by my own experience of them existing in conflict with them. The way I move through the grief of the incongruity of my identity versus what the hormones in my body tried to give me is by supplementing my own hormones, affirming my own reality rather than what others believed they saw in me. By choosing to break away from society and take a lifelong vacation at the Estrogen Inn, I've managed to feel comfortable with myself in a way that I don't think even many cis people know, and navigate through my grief. And is that wrong of me? For essentially saying fuck that to what my family had told me growing up and what my first group of friends believed, based on what facts they saw that led them to a truth that hormones could never do enough to meet the reality I wanted? Am I perverting the objective human experience, the sanctity of reality, as much as the person who chooses to let their grief for a lost one flow through them in whatever bizarre or hallucinatory form it takes? I would argue no to the point on grief, and I would similarly argue no to the point on trans care. Sure, from a scientific standpoint it leads to exceptionally positive outcomes, but for this discussion specifically, I'm not that interested in science. I'm far more interested in the subjective experiences I and many other hormone-taking trans people have had, the personal axioms of our lives, from doing what we believe is right for us. Even if some study were to come out saying that there's a new effective treatment that allows those with dysphoria to become comfortably cis, with supposed better health outcomes than those who take hormones, that experience isn't my experience of life. That can't lend me a body whose uniqueness allows me to show myself in others' experiences I otherwise never could. If dysphoria is grief over what my body once took from me and transition is what I need to move through it, then I will let myself move through and change. Those who heckle it be damned. The unending yearning that grief has left me with, the desire to love myself that challenges me to be better to my body and soul and those of others, has brought me meaning greater than I could ever put to words. While one can quantify the health of my transition through samples of my blood can't tell you the spiritual significance that embracing this life, incongruent with society's common truths, has given me. I think this yearning exists in how a lot of people experience gender and sexual diversity, at least for me and others I've spoken to over the years. So many of us grow up wanting for the kind of love that we know is right for us, but parts of our souls and hearts conflict with the myths of our societies. We're left wistful for the loss of a world we wanted to grow up and live in despite never even knowing it. And even having our needs fulfilled in the present still leaves us with a grief over what could have been, which we can never convey to others in full. At least I know I certainly can't. The level of objectivity and language necessary for communicating with others makes explicating something so deep and ever-changing and personal impossible. Any words I say will never be complete. I will always be a void of catharsis, grieving these thoughts and feelings and losses that I can't hope to wrap up with a pretty bow, that society at large still deems perverse and deviant. I will always be left yearning for the closure society promises, and the right capitalist job, and the right straight family, and the right conformist anything, but only really exists in those perfect deviant loving worlds I imagined as a youth. And yet it is the unending imagination and yearning this eternal grief leaves me with that drives me to show the love I wish I was shown to all those I can, to push for a better, queerer world, one with more love and care and embrace greater than the myths which drive our conformist machines could ever create. Our strength, after all, is ultimately in our individuality, our subjective experiences. Human emotions are unpredictable, have logic altered by life experiences, and often disobey what seems sensible by scientific standards. Once you dig past the layers of supposed objectivity behind someone's actions, which society tries to will into existence, you find an infinite layer of subjective experiences, emotions, and behaviors. You find things that science can't yet explain, and at some point you have to make the judgment call to stop digging for logic and simply listen to that person, the way they experience the world, and take it as their axiomatic truth. And like all truths, it can be dismantled, and I find that the truths built on the acceptance and love of others are often far truer than all the rest. I can't help but wonder what we could learn from each other if we were all able to do this honestly. Our visions of ghosts are desires, our griefs are traumas, not as objects to fear for how they disagree with the myths, not as objects to fear for their newness, but as the results of our lives. Subconscious ways our brains attempt to work through the realities we lived, and not inconvenience us in the path to becoming a cog in a machine. What we could learn, what we could do for each other, how we could accept our griefs and our yearnings, how we could love, how we could live for the journey without catharsis, if we could talk about our experience rather than our myths. Clocking in at 25 hours long at an average reading speed, SeaBed isn't quite the shortest visual novel around, but it is way more approachable than some of the behemoths I've covered and packs a lot into that short length. It's philosophically engaging, inventive in its writing style, contemplative in its thinking, and deeply empathetic in how it explores grief and the ways in which we navigate the world. Of the many books and visual novels I've read across many genres from many authors, SeaBed stands out amongst all of those as one of the most fascinating and inventive, a testament to the passion of its developers to be able to pull so much off despite the presumable lack of budget, and with a staff of merely 3 people no less. It's also, unlike many other games I cover on this channel, super accessible. It's available officially in Japanese, Cantonese, Mandarin, and English, as well as there being a planned Korean translation and unofficial translations to both Spanish and Russian, which I can't vouch for whatsoever, but it really says something about this game that people care so much that they're willing to put all this effort in. And in my mind, it's very well placed. Regardless of whether you're a Yuri Buta or a casual girl enjoyer, a seasoned veteran of moe gay wars, or have never picked up a VN in your life, or countless other factors, SeaBed has something to offer for all those who choose to read it and engage with it on its terms, to think on what it has to say and open themselves up to moving forward and embracing new journeys. It is a hopeful game that says despite the grief all of us are working through all of the time, hope and joy aren't things we have to live without, that catharsis and closure aren't things we need. No matter where you've been, and no matter what you've been through, there are always new seas to chart. There are always new things to see. There are always memories to keep you going through it all.